coming to you from the CTICC in Cape Town, where major role players on the continent have gathered to speak about oil and gas and the energy sector of the African continent going into the future. To talk to us a little bit more, we have Guillaume Doan of Africa Oil and Power, and he's the CEO of Africa Oil and Power. Guillaume, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
First of all, what's the aim of your conference? You're bringing so many people together. What are they doing here?
Every single year, the mission of Africa Oil and Power remains the same. We want to be a vehicle to promote investment in the oil, gas, and power industries of the continent, to be a platform for the African governments to really drive their investment agenda.
What does it look like for the continent at the moment? We hear of the discovery of oil and gas everywhere, but what is the real prospect for the continent as far as that resource is concerned?
Well, we have to say that 2019 is an improvement over previous years. Since 2014, when we had a major decline in the oil price, there's been a gradual recovery, and 2019 is a much better year than previous years. Nevertheless, we think that the investment that's being put into the oil and gas industry of the African continent is insufficient to, one, reverse production declines that we're seeing in major producers, to drive ongoing economic growth, and to provide power access to African countries that are in sore need of increasing generating capacity.
Can Africa compete with the Middle East and the Americas when it comes to oil and gas?
When it comes to the resource base, absolutely. Bar none, when companies come to Africa to look for oil and gas, they make large discoveries. But when it comes to the investment terms, no. We believe that Africa's investment terms need to be more competitive. Right now, Africa is competing with shale oil in Texas. They're competing with the Gulf of Mexico. They're competing with the Middle East. And right now, the investment terms are way too tough given the current climate.
So how do we change that? What are those terms about, and how do we change that?
It requires really dialogue between the private sector and the government in order to convince the government to relax the terms a little bit and make the government revenue come down a little bit to really entice companies to come to the African countries and take up licenses. We've seen just this year so many African countries hosting licensing rounds: Ghana, Equatorial Guinea, Uganda, Gabon, Angola. All of them are dedicated to the same mission, to reverse production declines. Their mission to attract investors will be a lot easier if the investment terms become a lot easier.
So if there's a decline in the production because of the lack of investment, how do we use this to our benefit as a continent?
Well, a lot of countries depend on oil and gas revenue to drive economic growth. So without that economic growth, the oil and gas industry could not continue to be the engine of economic development in many of these countries. Oil and gas cannot be a multiplier for other economic sectors. This is what we're advocating strongly for.
And we're hearing there's a big shout out around the world about climate change and action groups and all of that. Why still invest in oil and gas if it seems that the future is more towards renewable energy?
It's a great question, and this is something that came about. Greta Thunberg was at the United Nations last week, and she spoke truth to power, urging global economies to do something about climate change. But I think the global narrative when it comes to climate change is very divorced from the African narrative, which requires economic development. When you have less than 50% of the continent with access to electricity, when you have so much poverty amongst youth, when you have such high unemployment, even here in South Africa where we have such high unemployment, the African continent needs to have the freedom in order to develop its own resources. So, we believe that fossil fuels still have a role to play. Over the next 30 years, fossil fuels will have an enormous role to play, which is not to say that we don't need to make climate change an urgent priority at the same time.
Lastly, you gave us astronomical numbers a little bit earlier. Talk to us about the share that the continent gets as compared to the rest of the world when it comes to money flowing in.
Right. Well, again, for us, the number one most critical issue in the energy industry of Africa is investment. When you compare the investment that is going across the board in all energy resources, from oil, gas, to power, thermal power, renewable energy, energy efficiency, energy conservation, $1.85 trillion globally. 2.5% of that went into Africa in 2018. That just gives you a sense of the challenge, of the proportion that Africa has ahead of it. And it speaks to why only 43% of the African continent has access to electricity.
Thank you very much. That was Mr. Guillaume Doan, the CEO of Africa Oil and Power, saying that there is still a role to play for fossil fuels in the next 30 years or so. And this is the platform where countries and major players in the field meet and hopefully talk about the futures of the various countries in Africa. There's been recent discoveries in countries like Senegal. And according to Guillaume Doan and the Africa Oil and Power Conference, there's a future for this still.